Hey guys. Trains are a very big part of life of Taiwan. You maybe are wondering how is this railway created? Well, in this video, I will talk about the history of Taiwan Railway. Now let's begin. It all started in 1887. Construction begins on first railway in Taiwan between Keelung and Taipei in early March. 4 years later, first rail line completed, 20 miles branch from Tuatusha to Keelung, driven by English engineers. 2 years later, first Formosa Railway completed. 2 years later, Taiwan ceded to Japan by China following the end of the First Sino-Japanese War. Ministry of Taiwan Railway established by the Japanese government. Reconstruction begins of Kirun Taihoku branch to avoid numerous short curves and steep grades. Work is also performed on the line leading from Taihoku to the south. Total cost of these improvements reaching nearly 2 million yen. Railway under direct control of the military department. 2 years later, the railway comes under control of civil department. 1 year later, local island government announces its intention of carrying on the work itself. 1 year later, work started on the southern line from Dagu north to Tainan, a distance of 28 miles completed in November 1900. Japanese Diet granted 30 million yen for 10 years to cover cost of main line from Taihoku to Takao. 1 year later, the Keelung and Hsinchu lines were repaired. Rolling stock was added. Work commenced on the short branch line from Taihoku to Tansui, completed in June 1901. Over 7 million yen spent by Japanese government on Formosan railways by 1903. 8 years later, main line from Taihoku to Takao is complete. 14 years later, the West Coast line is completed. 2 years later, the Jiren line is completed. 2 years later, the Taito line is completed. 14 years later, the railways are repeatedly bombed by the Allies during World War II. 1 year later, the Haito line is completed. 1 year later, the railway is still bombed by the Allies. 3 years later, Taiwan is handed over to the Republic of China. 3 years later, Taiwan Railways Administration established. 31 years later, West Coast line fully electrified. The North Link line is completed. 10 years later, rail lines running through downtown Taipei moved underground. The new Taipei main station is completed. The Shen-Ao line ceases passenger operations. 2 years later, the South Link line completed, completing the rail loop around Taiwan. 6 years later, online reservations become available. 1 year later, the former Mountain line ceases operations. 2 years later, the Yilan line is electrified. 1 year later, various special trains targeting tourists are offered. 2 years later, the North Link line is electrified. 4 years later, the Taroko Express begins operations. The launch of local express trains with the delivery of Taiwan Railway EMU 700 series. The Niwan line is temporarily closed in order to allow the construction of the Liujia line. 3 years later, the former Mountain line is reopened to steam trains on special occasions. The Fusing Semi-Express of the Taiwan Railways Administration was phased out of regular service completely after December 21, 2010. 1 year later, the Shaolin line is opened. The Liujia line is opened. 1 year later, the Linku line ceases all operations. The creation of Miss Taiwan Railway. 1 year later, the Puyuma Express begins operation. The Pingtung line is scheduled to be electrified, completing the electrification of the entire rail loop around Taiwan by 2020. 1 year later, the new local train EMU 800 begins operation. The maximum speed of local trains is increased to 130 km per hour. 7 years later, the new local train EMU 900 begins operation. The intercity EMU 3000 also begin operation, intending to replace old and outdated rolling stock. 1 year later, final Fusing Semi-Express train journey. 2 years later, Taiwan Railway Administration will become a state-owned joint stock corporation, Taiwan Railway Corporation, on January 1, 2024.